The clock struck midnight, and the city slept, except for one man. He walked into the dimly lit alley, his coat heavy with secrets, in his pocket a blood-stained note, in his eyes the fear of a hunted man. And then a single gunshot shattered the silence. By morning his body would be found, but the note would vanish, and with it the only clue to a crime no one was supposed to uncover. Dear friends, today we bring you a gripping and suspenseful detective tale filled with unexpected twists and turns. The text is read by D.R. Ramy. The Case of the Vanishing Widow is an early yet masterful work, showcasing the brilliance of our legendary detective, Victor Graves. Set against the backdrop of 1920s London, a city bustling with post-war changes, this story captures the intricate dynamics of wealth, deception, and betrayal. During this period, many individuals sought new beginnings, and not all of them were honest in their pursuits. This shifting social landscape plays a crucial role in the mystery surrounding Mrs. Eleanor Ashford's sudden and unexplained disappearance. What begins as a routine missing person case quickly spirals into something far more sinister, proving once again that even the most seemingly innocent matters can conceal dark and deadly secrets. Victor Graves' keen intellect and relentless pursuit of the truth will unravel a web of lies that no one saw coming. It all started on an unremarkable morning when Victor Graves, seated in his study, scanned the front page of the London Chronicle. The headlines were sensational as always. Notorious conman escapes justice. Heiress found dead in locked room. Bank scandal. Millions vanish overnight. Graves raised an eyebrow, amused by the city's never-ending cycle of crime and deceit. Just as he was about to pour himself a cup of tea, a sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant Edward Hale peered inside, his face reflecting urgency. "A lady insists on seeing you, sir. Claims it's a matter of life and death." Graves sighed, setting down his paper. "They always do, Hale. But let's see if this one is worth my time." A moment later the door swung open, revealing a woman in her late 50s, her eyes frantic yet calculating. She was dressed in fine clothing, but her hands trembled as she clutched a delicate lace handkerchief. "Mr. Graves, you must help me," she gasped. "My employer, Mrs. Ashford, has vanished without a trace." One moment she was there, preparing for her afternoon tea.
In the next, gone.
No note, no explanation, just gone. Graves leaned back in his chair, studying her with piercing eyes. "Tell me everything," he said smoothly, already sensing that beneath this woman's panic lay a truth far more twisted than a simple disappearance. On a crisp autumn morning, as I sat across from my meticulous companion, Hercule Poirot, he delicately adjusted the angle of his coffee cup, ensuring perfect symmetry with the saucer. His morning ritual of order was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door, followed by the abrupt entrance of a flustered woman, her hat askew, her breath heavy from the hurried climb up the stairs. "You're Poirot?" she demanded. Barely affording him a moment for pleasantries, Poirot inclined his head with practiced grace. "Indeed, madam, and you are." The woman barely registered his inquiry, instead scanning him with a look of undisguised skepticism. Not what I imagined. Papers make you sound grander." Poirot lifted an eyebrow but remained silent, his patience tested. "Well," she continued, undeterred,
"I need you to find my maid."
"Walked off without a trace, right in the middle of making my afternoon tea."
Imagine the audacity.
"And with not a word. If that's not a crime, I don't know what is." I choked back a laugh, but Poirot's expression remained impassive. "I fear, madam, that such an inquiry is beneath my expertise," she said, his voice laced with a dignified dismissal. The woman, however, was undeterred. "Oh, too grand for domestic troubles, are you? Only chase after lost and secret documents," she scoffed, arms folded. "Well, let me tell you, Monsieur Poirot, in my world, a missing maid is as dire as a stolen crown. A household without order is chaos, and I won't stand for it." For a moment Poirot's dignity battled his amusement, then in a rare instance, his lips curled into a small smile. "Madam," he said, leaning forward, eyes twinkling, "tell me everything." Poirot leaned back in his chair, adjusting the crease in his trousers with meticulous precision. when the door burst open to reveal a woman of formidable presence, her face flushed with indignation. "Monsieur Poirot," she announced, barely allowing a breath to separate her words. "You must help me. My maid has vanished into thin air." Poirot, ever the epitome of poise, merely raised an eyebrow. "A missing maid, madam." He steepled his fingers. "Surely she has merely found employment elsewhere." But the woman, Mrs. Eleanor Graves, as she soon introduced herself, shook her head vehemently. "Not possible. Mary has been with me for 8 years, never a complaint, never a sign of discontent, and yet on Thursday evening, she stepped out to post a letter and never returned." At this, Poirot's sharp gaze flickered with interest. "No word, no belongings taken." Mrs. Graves hesitated. "Well, that's the odd part, Monsieur Poirot. This morning, while I was at the grocer's, someone came to collect her trunk. The maid Annie, let them take it, said it was a friend of Mary's, but I don't believe a word of it." Poirot rose slowly, straightening his waistcoat. "Curious indeed, madam. And the girl Annie, does she offer any insight?" Mrs. Graves sniffed. "Oh, she claims ignorance, but you know how these girls are, loyal to each other beyond reason." Poirot gave a small nod. "And Mary herself, was she troubled of late?" A pause, then in a reluctant whisper, "Perhaps. She received a letter a few days ago, looked pale as a ghost after reading it." Poirot's interest sharpened. "And where is this letter now?" Mrs. Graves sighed. "Destroyed, I presume. She wouldn't show it to anyone." Poirot's fingers drummed against the armrest. "Then, madam, we have a puzzle indeed. A disappearance, a cryptic letter, and a trunk taken by an unknown party."
I believe it is time I paid a visit to your household.
Mrs. Graves exhaled in relief, but Poirot, as he reached for his hat, cast a glance at me with a gleam of excitement. "Hastings, my friend, I have a feeling this is no ordinary case. The missing maid of Kensington. It has a rather fine ring to it, n'est-ce pas?" The house at 88 Wilcroft Lane stood in a prim, well-mannered row of respectable homes. Its lace curtains hung stiffly, its brass knocker gleamed under the pale morning sun, an image of quiet order, and yet within, disorder simmered beneath the surface. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a stout woman of 50, paced the polished wooden floor of her drawing-room, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Her face, usually composed, was clouded with unease. The moment the doorbell rang, she strode to the entrance, and flung it open with a sharp motion. The man standing on her doorstep was smaller than she had expected, dressed impeccably in a dark suit. His polished shoes barely made a sound as he stepped inside. His neatly groomed mustache twitched slightly as he removed his gloves, his sharp green eyes scanning the hallway with swift bird-like curiosity. "You must help me, Monsieur Leclerc," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice edged with both authority and desperation. "Margaret Rourke, my cook, she has disappeared, simply walked out on Wednesday, and never returned." Leclerc took his time removing his hat, adjusting his cuffs before replying. "Ah, madame, a missing servant, hardly an uncommon thing, no?" His voice was light, teasing almost, but his eyes had already darkened with interest. Mrs. Whitmore bristled. "No, you don't understand. Margaret has been with me for 12 years. She is not the sort to vanish. If she wished to leave my employ, she would have said so. And yet," she leaned in, dropping her voice to a whisper, "this morning she sent for her trunk." Leclerc's eyebrow arched ever so slightly. "Ah, that does change the situation. And how, may I ask, did she retrieve it?" "A delivery man, Carter Patterson, I was told, but there was no note, no explanation. She simply had it collected while I was out at the grocer's." Leclerc pressed his fingertips together, tapping them lightly. "Curious. That suggests she left of her own will, yet took great care to avoid speaking to you directly. Tell me, madame, had there been any quarrel, any reason she might have wished to leave suddenly?" "None. That's what is so unsettling." Mrs. Whitmore's voice wavered slightly, the first true crack in her composure. "She was loyal, respectable. She had a good life here. If she had plans to leave, why not say so? Who else resides in your household?" "Only Annie, my housemaid," Mrs. Whitmore replied, rubbing her temples. "A good girl but a bit silly, always daydreaming, more interested in stories of romance than in minding her duties properly." Leclerc's lips curled into a knowing smile. And what did she say when you questioned her about Margaret's disappearance? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. She acted, well, strange. At first she claimed to know nothing. Then she suggested something absurd, something about white slavers. Leclerc tilted his head. White slavers? Yes, some ridiculous notion that Margaret was lured away by foreign men with promises of perfume and sweets. I dismissed it, of course. But still, Mrs. Whitmore's fingers trembled slightly. There's something she's not telling me. I can feel it. Leclerc straightened his cuffs. Ah, madame, you bring me a delicious puzzle. A vanished cook, a mysteriously collected trunk, and a housemaid spinning tales of abduction. He turned to his assistant, Dawson, who had been listening in silence. What do you make of it? Dawson, a tall, sturdy man with a weathered face, frowned. If she packed her trunk beforehand, then she knew she was leaving. It doesn't sound like an abduction, but why would she keep it secret? Why indeed? Leclerc moaned, eyes gleaming. There is always a reason, my friend, and I suspect the answer lies within the walls of 88 Willcroft Lane. He turned back to Mrs. Whitmore. I shall visit your home at once. I will speak with this Annie, and if there is a secret to be found, rest assured, madame, I will find it. With that, he reached for his hat and gloves, a small knowing smile playing on his lips. A cook had vanished, but Leclerc suspected this was no ordinary disappearance. Something was hidden in the shadows of Willcroft Lane, and he intended to uncover it. The house at 42 Durham Street held an air of quiet dignity, but behind its polished mahogany doors, a storm brewed. Mrs. Harriet Lowe, a woman of sharp eyes and sharper words, paced the sitting room, her fingers tapping impatiently against her silk apron. She had not slept well, not since her maid Ruth Chapman had vanished without a trace. She barely waited for the detective to step inside before launching into her concerns. It isn't like her, Inspector Hargreaves. Ruth was steady, reliable. She had no reason to run off. And yet, Wednesday evening, she went out for her usual walk, and that was the last we saw of her. Her voice wavered slightly, but her posture remained rigid, almost defiant, as if daring the inspector to contradict her. Hargreaves, a tall man with an unassuming presence, removed his hat with deliberate care, his keen blue eyes scanning the room. And yet, Mrs. Lowe, she did not return. You say she left as usual, nothing out of place. Not a thing, she insisted. She had just finished setting the supper table, even mentioned what we'd have. She was particular like that. If there's any blackberry tart left, she said, we'll have that, with a bit of cold ham and mustard. That's the last thing she ever told me. Hargreaves' brows knitted together. You said she had no reason to leave, but was there any sign she was uneasy? Had she quarreled with anyone? Received a letter, perhaps? Mrs. Lowe hesitated, the first crack in her composure. She did seem quiet that day, and now that you mention it, she had a visitor on Tuesday. A man, tall, well-dressed, spoke with her at the back door. I thought nothing of it at the time. Did you recognize him? No, but Ruth seemed distracted after. I asked her about it, and she brushed it off, said it was a mistake. The detective glanced at his notebook, making a quick note before shifting the conversation. Tell me about the rest of the household. My husband Albert works at the shipping office, steady man. And Mr. Fenwick, our lodger. He's been with us nearly a year now. And what of Mr. Fenwick? Mrs. Lowe pursed her lips. Keeps to himself. A quiet sort, always with his nose in the papers. Works in finance, I believe. He didn't seem particularly bothered when I told him Ruth had vanished. Just muttered something about women being unreliable, and carried on with his breakfast. Hargreaves tapped his fingers against his chin. And your husband, how did he react? Mrs. Lowe's face darkened. Oh, Albert wouldn't trouble himself over a maid. Plenty more where she came from, he said. That's all. The detective leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. Curious, a young woman vanishes without a trace, and neither man in this house seems the least bit concerned. Tell me, Mrs. Lowe, has anything else been amiss lately? Anything strange? She hesitated again, just for a moment. I did notice, the cellar door was unlocked yesterday. It shouldn't have been, and Ruth's trunk, It was collected early this morning, but not by Ruth. A man came for it, said she sent for it. Hargreaves' grip on his notebook tightened, and you let it go. I thought she had simply gone to another place, but now I don't know. The room fell silent for a beat. Then Hargreaves gave a small knowing smile. Mrs. Lowe, I believe there is far more to this than a missing maid, and I suspect that Ruth Chapman was keeping a dangerous secret. A chill settled in the air. Something was lurking beneath the surface of this quiet, respectable house, and Hargreaves intended to drag it into the light. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11, its deep chime reverberating through the dimly lit drawing room, filling the silence with an eerie finality. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows on the wallpaper, making the room feel both alive and suffocating. The scent of old books, lavender polish, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. Mrs. Eleanor Graves sat stiffly on the edge of her high-backed armchair, her fingers twitching over the faded upholstery. Her usually well-kept silver hair was slightly disheveled, and her thin lips were pursed with a mixture of worry and frustration. Across from her, Detective Julian Harrington observed her carefully, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He had seen many expressions like hers before: dread, confusion, and that nagging feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. She wouldn't have left like that, Mrs. Graves whispered, her voice almost pleading, as if willing Julian to believe her. Not without a word. Agnes was loyal, meticulous, and she knew the rules of this house. Julian leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting around the room, taking in the subtle details. A faint indentation on the worn rug near the hearth caught his attention, a space that seemed empty, as though a chair or footstool had been recently moved. The air carried a certain stillness, a quiet that wasn't just silence but an absence. And yet, he murmured, she is gone. Agnes Halloway, the household maid, had vanished without a trace. She had left behind her few possessions, including the emerald brooch she always pinned to her apron, a cherished heirloom she never parted with. Even her wages, neatly counted and set aside in an envelope, remained untouched. That was the detail that unsettled him the most. If she had planned to leave, why hadn't she taken her money? Was she unhappy here? Julian asked, his voice calm, measured. Mrs. Graves hesitated. Her gaze flickered towards the staircase, towards the upper floors where the house's secrets seemed to nestle in the shadows. She was watchful, she admitted finally. Ever since Mr. Redfern took the upstairs suite, Julian's interest piqued. The lodger? She nodded, lowering her voice. A strange man, reclusive, always locking his door, even when he was inside. Sometimes I would hear him pacing at night, long after the house had gone to bed. She shuddered slightly. Agnes noticed it too. I could tell it unsettled her. Julian's mind worked quickly. A missing maid, an enigmatic lodger. The pieces weren't forming a clear picture yet, but there was something off about the entire situation. And your husband? He asked. What did he think of Agnes leaving? A flicker of something unreadable crossed Mrs. Graves' face. Her hands gripped the armrests a little tighter. Henry is practical, she said, almost dismissively. He said to hire another. Servants come and go, Eleanor, that's what he told me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But I don't believe that. She swallowed hard. Something isn't right. Julian leaned forward, lowering his voice. What was the last thing she said to you before she disappeared? Mrs. Graves' brow furrowed in concentration. She thought for a moment before speaking. It was over supper, she said slowly. I had made a cherry tart, and there were leftovers. She smiled at me and said, if there's any tart left, we'll have it with tea tomorrow. A chill crept up Julian's spine. That wasn't the farewell of a woman planning to leave in the night. That was the statement of someone expecting to be there the next day. Someone who had no reason to run. He rose from his chair, adjusting his coat. The fire crackled, but the warmth had drained from the room. That means she had no intention of running away, he said gravely. Mrs. Graves' face paled. Then where is she? The grandfather clock chimed again, louder this time. The house, for the first time, felt truly empty. The heavy rain drummed against the windows, distorting the city lights outside into a blur of gold and silver. Inside the dimly lit study, Hercule Poirot sat with his hands steepled, his sharp eyes fixed on the letter before him. The paper bore the faint scent of lavender, and the hurried, anxious handwriting suggested a mind troubled by fear. Mrs. Beatrice Langley had written to him in desperate tones, pleading for his intervention in a matter that on the surface seemed trivial: a missing maid, a sum of money, and a household drowning in whispered suspicions. But Poirot knew better. Nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Hastings, seated across from him, leaned back in his chair, watching his friend's expression darken. A domestic dispute, Poirot. Surely you don't think this requires your, how shall I put it, exquisite talents? He asked, only half teasing. Poirot let out a sharp breath, his moustache twitching with irritation. Ah, mon ami, that is where you err. The greatest of mysteries often present themselves in the most unassuming of disguises. A missing maid is nothing. Bah, I tell you, Hastings, it is everything. A servant does not vanish into thin air without reason. And here, he tapped the letter, we have the smell of something rotten. Hastings chuckled. Rotten, you say? And what precisely is rotten? Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Consider this. The girl disappears, but she does not take her belongings, her wages untouched, her shoes neatly lined by the door, and then he lifted a finger. Her mistress sends a frantic letter. But, Hastings, before I can even set foot in the house, another letter arrives, this one dismissing me entirely. A mere misunderstanding, she says, an overreaction, and yet she encloses a guinea for my trouble. Hastings frowned. So you think? I think, Poirot interrupted, rising abruptly, that I do not like to be dismissed comme ça. No, something is amiss, Hastings, and I will get to the bottom of it. With a flourish, he picked up the telephone and placed an advertisement in the papers. If Margaret Stokes wishes to hear of something to her advantage, she is requested to communicate with this address. Days passed in agonizing silence, Poirot's restlessness growing by the hour. Each morning he sifted through letters, only to toss them aside with an exasperated sigh. He rejected case after case, missing jewels, fraudulent wills, even a high-profile theft, fixating instead on the mystery of Margaret Stokes. Hastings, bewildered, watched his friend's obsession grow, and then on the fourth day, the knock came. Mrs. Hudson, their landlady, appeared in the doorway, breathless. A woman is here to see you, sir. Says her name is Margaret Stokes. Poirot sprang to his feet, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Enfin, he declared, the game, my dear Hastings, is truly afoot. Moments later, Margaret Stokes was ushered in, a woman of solid build, her face lined with the kind of worry that years could not erase. She hesitated on the threshold, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I came because of the advertisement, she said, but I don't see what's to my advantage. I already got what was promised to me. Poirot's smile was razor sharp. Did you, mademoiselle, or did someone make you believe you did? The woman stiffened. A flicker of fear passed over her face. Hastings, ever perceptive, caught the slight tremble in her hands. What do you mean? She asked cautiously. Poirot tilted his head. I mean, Mademoiselle Stokes, that you are not the only one who has disappeared, and that, I believe, is where our mystery truly begins. The storm outside raged on, but within the room, an even darker storm was brewing. Mrs. Alina Carter had been deeply worried. She feared something dreadful had happened to him. Jonathan Miles furrowed his brows in genuine surprise. She didn't get my letter, not a single word. The man across from him hesitated before adding, almost persuasively, would you mind telling me the entire story, from the beginning? Jonathan needed no further urging. He took a deep breath, and plunged into his account. It happened on Wednesday night. I was just a street away from home when a tall man, towering really, with an air of authority, stepped out from the shadows and called my name. Mr. Jonathan Miles, he asked, his voice calm yet oddly compelling. I nodded. I've been searching for you, he continued. Your name was given to me at No. 42. They said you often walk this route at this hour. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "Mr. Miles, I have traveled all the way from Argentina to find you. Tell me, do you happen to know the maiden name of your great-aunt on your father's side?" His question startled me, but I answered nonetheless. "Margaret Holloway." The man's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. Now listen carefully. Your great-aunt had a close confidant, Eleanor Fawkes. You may not have heard of her, but she was like a sister to your great-aunt. She married a wealthy landowner in Buenos Aires. Their children passed away young, and when she herself died months ago, she left behind an astonishing fortune. By a peculiar clause in her will, you, Mr. Miles, are the sole heir to an estate right here in England, along with a significant sum of money." I felt lightheaded. My first instinct was disbelief, suspicion even. The man must have noticed, because he smiled knowingly. "Quite right to be cautious, Mr. Miles. Here, take a look at these." He handed me a packet, official-looking documents, a stamped letter from a law firm in Buenos Aires, and his own business card. His name was Mr. Fletcher, from Hollis and Fletcher Associates. "There are conditions, of course," he added smoothly. "The bequest is valid only if you take possession of the estate before midnight tomorrow. And the second condition," he hesitated. "It's minor, really, simply that you must not be working in any form of government employment." A chill ran down my spine. My job, an investigative analyst at a government agency, immediately came to mind. "But I am," I blurted. "Didn't they tell you that?" His face darkened slightly. "Ah, that is unfortunate. Very unfortunate indeed. Does that mean I lose everything?" My voice barely concealed my rising anxiety. He tapped his fingers against the documents before nodding, as if arriving at a solution. "There are always alternative routes, Mr. Miles. Loopholes, if you will. The way out is simple. As of this afternoon, you are no longer employed." I hesitated. "But my contract—" "You can resign at any moment, Mr. Miles. You forfeit your pending wages, and that's that. Your employer will understand, given the circumstances, but the problem here is time. You must be on the 11:30 train from St. Pancras to reach the estate in time. I can advance you the funds for the fare, and you can write a resignation letter at the station. I will personally deliver it on your behalf and explain everything." He was convincing. His words seemed reasonable, almost logical. And so, an hour later, I was on the train, my mind racing faster than the wheels beneath me. It wasn't until I reached the town of Lancaster, with the fog creeping in from the hills, that a dreadful thought occurred to me. What if this was a setup? A scheme like the ones you read about in crime novels? But I was already there. At the address he'd provided, I found a law office, just as he had said. The property transfer was real. The money, an initial sum of £200,000, was in my name. Everything seemed legitimate, and yet something gnawed at me. Mr. Fletcher had sent my belongings up to the estate, but strangely, there had been no response from my employer, not even a formal acknowledgement of my resignation, and curiously, my work files, classified ones, had disappeared from my personal locker before I left. Had I walked into something far more sinister than an inheritance? Detective Hawthorne sat in his dimly lit study, the golden glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the worn mahogany. The air smelled faintly of old books and tobacco, a silent witness to the many cases he had unraveled within these very walls. His sharp eyes traced the jagged ink of the message before him. "Time is running out." 4 simple words, yet they carried a weight that pressed against his chest like a storm cloud ready to break. Across from him, a woman sat nervously, her slender fingers gripping the handle of an old leather suitcase, as though it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted as she struggled to steady her breath. Hawthorne observed the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if expecting unseen eyes to be watching. "I don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head. "A man came this morning. He said I had to leave immediately, that I was in danger. He didn't give me a choice." Hawthorne's fingers drummed against the desk, his mind already peeling back the layers of deception. "This man, what did he look like?" She swallowed hard. I don't know. He wore a hat, kept his head low, and his voice, it was different, forced, like he was trying to sound foreign. She hesitated, then reached into the folds of her coat and produced a small brass key. He left this, the detective took it carefully, tilting it under the warm glow of the lamp. It was an old-fashioned key, its surface scratched and worn by time, but it wasn't the rust or the faded engravings that made Hawthorne's pulse quicken. It was the initials carved into the base. His breath hitched, the puzzle pieces in his mind snapping together with a chilling certainty. "Get a car, Hastings," he said suddenly, his voice tight with urgency. Hastings, who had been quietly observing from the corner, blinked. "What? Where are we going?" Hawthorne was already on his feet, slipping his coat over his shoulders in one swift motion. "If we're lucky, we're catching a thief. If we're not," his gaze darkened, "we're walking into something much worse." The rain had slicked the cobbled streets into a mirror, reflecting the glow of street lamps in fractured golden pools. Their car weaved through the night, the rhythmic hum of the tires swallowed by the distant sounds of the city, a lone dog howling, the muffled laughter of a late-night crowd, a church bell tolling somewhere far away. "Tell me, Hawthorne," Hastings finally said, gripping the wheel, "what exactly are we chasing?" The detective exhaled, his breath misting against the window. "A lie, Hastings, a perfectly constructed lie." His fingers curled around the brass key in his pocket. This wasn't about getting the woman out of the house. This was about getting someone in. Someone who needed time and privacy. The car jerked to a stop outside 89 Wellington Street. The house loomed before them, its tall iron gate slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. A single light flickered in an upstairs window, but the rest of the house was draped in darkness. Hawthorne stepped out cautiously, his shoes crunching against the wet gravel. His every sense was on high alert. He pushed the door open. It swung inward without resistance. The scent of burnt paper met his nose instantly. That was his first warning. The second came in the form of a single candle left flickering on the grand oak table in the center of the room. Someone had been here recently. Then he saw it. Against the far wall stood a battered trunk, its lid slightly ajar, revealing the faint imprint of something that had been inside, but was no longer there. Hawthorne stepped closer, running a gloved hand over the cracked leather. It wasn't just any trunk, it was a trunk with history, a trunk with a story, a trunk someone was willing to commit crimes for. He exhaled sharply. "We're too late." Hastings, who had just entered, frowned. "Too late for what?" Hawthorne turned to him, his expression grim. "We're dealing with someone who doesn't just steal money, Hastings. They steal identities. They steal pasts." He gestured to the empty trunk, "and tonight they just erased something or someone forever." A long silence stretched between them before Hastings finally spoke, his voice low. "Then we find them." Hawthorne nodded, the fire of determination burning behind his eyes. "Yes," he murmured, gripping the brass key, "and we start with this." As the candlelight flickered, the mystery only deepened. What had been inside that trunk? And more importantly, where was it now? The train pulled into Blackfriars Station, its whistle echoing against the steel and glass of the platform. Detective Alistair Graves stepped off, his sharp gaze cutting through the bustling crowd. He had received an anonymous letter that morning, 5 words scrawled hastily on aged parchment. "Meet me at the last bench." A cryptic summons, but Graves thrived on mystery. As he neared the final bench on the platform, he saw a man sitting there, Raymond Fletcher, a clerk at Howard & Sons, a finance firm riddled with corruption rumors. Fletcher's face was pale, his fingers twitching against the rim of his hat. Graves noticed the subtle tremor in his knee, the unmistakable sign of a man weighed down by fear. "You're late," Fletcher whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumbling train. They know everything." Before Graves could respond, a sudden shriek of metal on metal tore through the air. A second train hurtled into the station. In the momentary chaos, a shadow moved. A figure in a dark coat passed behind them. A glint of steel, a muffled gasp. When the train cleared, Fletcher slumped forward, a single crimson stain blossoming against his shirt. Graves caught him before he hit the ground, but the light in his eyes had already dimmed. The detective felt something cold slip into his palm, a small brass key, its surface slick with blood. The investigation led Graves to the Langford Club, an exclusive establishment where whispers of insider trading and vanishing fortunes danced like ghosts among the elite. He walked through the grand oak doors, where the scent of expensive whiskey and polished leather filled the air. A man in a velvet suit greeted him with a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Graves, we don't usually see your kind here." Graves smiled. "That's because my kind doesn't steal millions under the guise of old money sophistication." The room went silent. He slid the blood-stained key across the bar. "Does this mean anything to you?" The bartender's fingers twitched, but he feigned ignorance. Graves knew a lie when he saw one. This key was important, deadly important, and someone was willing to kill to keep it secret. His next stop was Fletcher's apartment. Inside, the air was thick with dust, as if untouched for days. Graves moved swiftly, scanning the bookshelves, the drawers, until his eyes landed on a leather trunk, identical to the one he had seen in an old newspaper clipping about a missing financier from 3 years prior. The same trunk, the same crime. He turned the key in the lock, his breath steady as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of documents, forged signatures, financial records, and something else. A bundle of fabric, carefully folded. With a sinking feeling, he unwrapped it, and found Fletcher's missing bank ledger, pages torn, numbers scratched out in a hurried scrawl. The last entry read, "Thursday, 2:45 p.m. Final transaction." Graves frowned. 2:45 p.m. was precisely the time Fletcher had been murdered. The next morning, Graves traced the financial discrepancies to Samuel Whitmore, a high-ranking executive with everything to lose. But before he could confront Whitmore, news broke. A trunk had been intercepted at Liverpool docks. Inside was something grotesque, a body disfigured beyond recognition, with only one identifier, a small tattoo on the wrist. Graves felt a chill snake down his spine. Fletcher had no tattoos. Then who the hell was in that trunk? He murmured. Suddenly the pieces fell into place. Fletcher had known something damning, but he wasn't just a victim, he had been set up. His death was designed to send a message, and the real mastermind, still out there, still watching. As Graves looked at the bloody key in his hand, he realized this wasn't just a case of fraud, it was something far worse. It was a cover-up for a murder yet to come.